Tiffany, the CEO and founder of Kite PR, and I'm here with Linda Ong. She's the CEO and founder of CULTIQUE. Linda, would you like to introduce CULTIQUE?
At CULTIQUE, we're cultural specialists. We advise companies on changing cultural norms and how to be relevant with your brand, your product, or your campaign.
So Linda, you've been a cultural advisor to so many different companies in media and technology. And I've always been a big believer in just sharing a lot of the knowledge along the way. As we celebrate our 10-year anniversary, we're taking a closer look at mentorship. Tell me, how have you relied on mentors to guide your career to where you are today?
Well, I'm a big believer in mentorship because I've been the beneficiary of many fairy godmothers and fairy godfathers. That's how I call the wisdom that I've received, because I once had to explain to my son, who's 27 and starting his career in the media and entertainment business. And I talked to him about the value of mentors. And he said, "Mom, what is a mentor?" And I said, "A mentor is actually someone in your professional life that believes in you more than you believe in yourself." And I think that is really the role of what I call fairy godmothers and fairy godfathers, is that they have the ability to bring their wisdom and experience to people who are at a younger or earlier start or stage in their career, and really give objective advice, which I've always found to be incredibly, incredibly valuable. So I really try to pass it on in everything I do.
I love that terminology of fairy godmothers and fairy godfathers. And I haven't heard that used before, but it's beautiful in a way where you think it's someone who really maybe sprinkles a little bit of fairy dust
Exactly.
in your career and gives you that reason to believe that you know is deep inside you. And when you think about that, what's the best advice that you've ever received?
Well, that's a great question, because I have the answer, my go-to answer from my fairy godmother. She once told me, never make a decision out of fear, only make a decision out of hope. And the way that manifests itself, or the way that it's manifested in my career, is I've had to, especially as an entrepreneur, make a lot of hard decisions in my life about the business, or even my own personal work-life balance, and how things contributed to my overall well-being. And what I really found is that whenever I did make a decision based out of hope, it was a very positive energy, which actually fueled much more positive events in my life. So for example, I had a client that was paying me a lot of money to do work that was not that satisfying, even though the client was very happy. But I found that the dynamic wasn't really creating a good dynamic for me. But it was a very lucrative contract. It was an annual retainer for one of my biggest clients. And I ended up going to the client after a lot of thought, saying, "I really don't think this is the best use of your money right now. And, I'm happy to help you in other ways, but we really need to change the nature of our relationship." And I could have been afraid and kept that relationship because of the money, and because of the, it's embarrassing or whatever. It causes a lot of consternation to resign an account. It's not an easy decision, but I really felt it was the right thing for the client and the right thing for me. So I made the decision out of hope. And 2 weeks later, I got a much bigger, much more lucrative multi-year account. And I really attribute it to the fact that I was able to not make a decision out of fear, but actually say goodbye to that client out of hope that it would be the best thing. And I have had numerous occasions where those kinds of situations have come up. And I guide people in their personal lives as well to also make decisions out of hope and not out of fear. So I hope that's something that is useful for everybody.
That's so important to think about when you think about the perspective oftentimes that you have when you're making important decisions overall through the course of your career, or even when you start to evaluate some recent current events and a lot of the uncertainty that we have. So is there a kind of a secret sauce that you have, so to speak, or a way that you really coach people to, how do you make a decision out of hope and not out of fear? Is there, push yourself into that decision-making mode?
Well, I think, Sarah, it's a great question, Tiffany. And it's a juicy one, because it's not one that everyone is, I would say, willing to be brave enough to make sometimes. It is much easier to make decisions out of fear. But I will say that Sarah Unger, my co-founder at CULTIQUE, and I share a very strong philosophy, which we're putting to work, as we speak. It's a very challenging economic environment. The media and entertainment and tech sector is in particular challenged. And so, we've had to pivot and stay very fluid to make sure that we don't get caught up in the maelstrom. But I think what keeps us going is recognizing that when we lead with our hearts and lead with the things that we're passionate about, the money comes. When we worry about money, again, the fear, it creates a negative energy that affects every interaction you have. I mean, you don't even think about it, but when you send an email for a new business prospect, that fear creeps into your language. And so we really, really, really try to keep things positive, keep things very passionate, and make sure that everybody on our team is doing something that they feel really fulfilled at. And we believe the returns will come.
That is such a great take to avoid making decisions out of fear. Lead with your heart. When it comes to the success you've had, it's so evident that you've been agile along the way, and you've really understood the importance of the pivot, as we all do, in a fellow founder's journey. I've done the same. Is there advice that you wish you knew at the start of your career that you know today?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think no one ever told me to lean into my passions. And I also think that nobody ever told me that, especially having your own business, I'm sure I heard it, but I didn't really believe, the ups and downs. I kind of still grew up kind of thinking that once you got to a high place, you just kept building higher and higher and higher. And what's interesting about this economic downturn, and I guess it's the benefit of being 60, which I'm going to be this year, is it's not my first rodeo. And in 23 years, I've seen a couple of bumps in the road. And it actually has helped me just understand, what to take seriously, how to apply that previous experience to the new experience, which is pretty one-to-one. And it's interesting because my business partner, Sarah, is younger. She hasn't gone through this before, but it's allowed me to say, hey, this is okay. We just have to be patient, to stick to our passions, be smart about it, which of course we're being in terms of running the business and pitching new business, but to not panic, because I've been here before. And I think that is something I didn't anticipate. I wish someone had told me that there were going to be times that were a little rough, but to not panic, just, again, lead with your heart and be smart about it. And I will also say that our business in the last 3 or 4 years, we have really pivoted it to, not even because we even did this before the pandemic, but it's been so useful. Being in the culture business, we need to move fast, and things in culture move incredibly fast, faster than we can even keep up. But it's still our job for our clients to stay on top of changes. And so I think that being very fluid has become a skill set and a muscle memory that our team has. And in fact, our ethos is be water, from Bruce Lee, which is, yes, about flowing and being able to adapt and be, flexible in situations, but it's also about being a little enigmatic and not always being so easy to identify. And I think that's something with our brand that we've really taken to heart, is that we want to be recognizable. But if you notice, every now and then we change our graphics, we change our logo. We just are always kind of trying to reflect that we are also a very fluid organization.
That's such a great point, and you've certainly been able to carve out a niche in the industry along the way. And I'm sure many aspiring professionals look up to you and want to go on that path. So if someone is listening in today and they're looking to go on the same journey and really shape out their career to follow yours, what advice would you give them? Are there certain skill sets that they need to have?
It's interesting. The only skill set I ever really had was that wanted to develop, was to be the best at whatever I did. And so as a result, which is kind of a hard out, I was a little bit of an overachiever in school and an only child. But, when you set out that you want to be the best at whatever you do, what's interesting is I've tried a lot of things, and I've tried my hand as a writer. I've tried my hand as an art director. I've tried my hand as, a strategist. Worn many, many, many hats. And what was great is I got a chance to work with really talented people and really talented and amazing brands and executives. But every time I sort of hit a wall and kind of felt like, there's a lot of really good writers out there, or there's a lot of really good brand strategists out there, it pushed me to maybe do things a little differently so I could still be the best. So that kind of like be the best at whatever you do, I think is really important, especially when it's your passion. So right now, I want to be the best cultural advisor for brands that want to stay on top of a fast changing world. That's very different than people that are in my space that do trend forecasting or future casting. That's very different. We want to be on top of the changes, and that's very specific. Now, that may be a tiny little, somebody once said that I made up my own job, and it's really true, because I think when you want to be the best at what you do, you strive for uniqueness. And I think that's one thing that was not a strategy of mine. It was really probably more of an insecurity that I just was like meeting people that were so much better at the things that I proclaimed to be doing, that I just had to keep pivoting until I found my own sweet spot.
That's great advice. You found your niche and you leaned into it, and that enabled you to build a career and further your career off the back of that. We talked a little bit earlier about fear, and oftentimes I hear from folks who are looking to advance their career, and especially women in the industry, just a fear of failure. Have an example that you'd like to share, maybe a time or example where there was a part in your career, and what did you learn from
it? So many times.
it?
I mean, I would say the first time, and maybe the only time, I got fired from a big high profile job, I was really embarrassed, and I thought nobody was going to ever call me again. And that just didn't happen. And I think that that's something, if you're young in your career, that I found that nobody told me, which is sometimes getting fired is the best thing that can happen to you. And there's no shame, especially now in this economic climate where people get laid off. It's just an opportunity to move on. And I think that, if you don't dwell on it and you just take whatever setback. I mean, I had to close a business in 2016, and I just did that the best way possible and moved on. So I think failure, look, if you're in the rocket science business, you're in the failure business, right? And entrepreneurs are about launching things, and NASA learns most when they fail and they can unpack and do a postmortem. And so I think it's really important before you move on from any situation, whether it's a success or a failure, to learn from what that experience gave you and take that going forward.
I think that's such a good point, to think about the learnings that you've had. And when we think about the current environment, there are a good amount of professionals that have experienced layoffs, that have been made redundant, and they might feel that failure that's associated with going through that big transition in their lifetime. When you think about some of the transition, of course, it's giving them the advice to learn from it, but what's the next best step for them to move forward?
I tell people who are in transitions to talk to as many people as will take their phone call, their Zoom, or their lunch, because what I found really helpful and what I recommend to people who are looking for new roles is very often you need to hear from other people how they see you to help you understand how you see yourself. And the other thing that's really helpful, and that I actually found was most helpful after I got fired, when I started talking to people, is they'd say, "What do you want to do?" And that was always hard, because I think when you're in a transition, you never really know. But it's almost more important, I think, to listen to what you say to other people and take note of how you kind of craft and mold that message over time. Because I think what happened was, when I started on my own, I would just tell people, "Well, I want to do this, I want to do that." And they'd say, "Well, have you ever thought about this? Have you ever thought about that?" And then I would kind of think, "Oh, well, that I never thought that I could do that, but I could certainly do that." And so it was the suggestions of people who were my clients, my colleagues, who saw me in ways I didn't see myself, that really helped me understand what my value was and how it was perceived. But ultimately, it comes down to, of course, like, what resonates with you. But I think that kind of listening tour, which we actually just did one for our company, because we're in a new year, it's a crazy market. We wanted to hear what was going on in our clients' worlds, but we also wanted to know how we internally should shape ourselves for the coming year, for our next 4 years. We're 4 years old now, almost. So I think that kind of listening to understand what other people are looking for, but really listening to understand what you're looking for, that can be really helpful.
I love that advice to think about taking a step back and go on a listening tour. Think about what others have to say about your industry, about the opportunities, and that can help you advance your own thinking. Brings me to the next question, just about the structure of mentorship. And I think we're at an interesting point in society now where some of the traditional structures around mentorship are changing. Maybe some of the notions are being challenged. What would you say to someone who feels like they need to find a mentor and need to get the best out of that relationship? What's your advice?
Well, I've been fortunate in that my mentors kind of came to me in some cases, or relationships started not as mentorship relations and developed that way. So I think it's really looking for, again, someone who has your best interest in heart. And my first mentor, my first fairy godmother, was a woman who's very senior in an organization I was working for, and saw my work. I was just sort of like an almost entry level, saw my work, invited me to lunch, and we're still very, very, very good, dear friends to this day. And I think that the mutual interest is the most important thing, and having interest in what your mentor's life is like, and what that person, what experiences that person has had that could be applicable to yours. But it really has to be two-way, because I think if it's too structured and it's really an obligation rather than something that's being done out of mutual interest, I think that it's less effective. And maybe if you are in a situation where it's very structured, I would encourage you, and this is what I say to everybody on my team, even in business meetings, the first step is always to forge a personal bond. Find some way to connect with your mentor, whether it's the college they went to, or a hobby they have, or their kids, or whatever, and try to really, it's what we do with all our clients, try to find a way to care. Because I think that if you have that mutual relationship where you care about each other's success, I'm a big believer in reverse mentoring. My fairy god daughters and sons mentor me all the time because they know things that I don't know. Those are the most productive kinds of relationships, I think.
Great, Linda, that's such great advice. Don't think about it as a formal relationship. Oftentimes it's just finding that fairy godmother or fairy godfather, someone who can sprinkle fairy dust on your career path and help you advance. Linda, thanks so much for sharing all these great points and all the advice that we have today. I appreciate your time. Anything else to share before we wrap?
Thank you, Tiffany. Well, I love these conversations, and you're very good. You could be a podcaster. I'll come talk to you anytime. I would say, probably I wish more people were open to being mentors. I'm not sure that they do it unless it's, assigned. But I have a little group I call the Fairy Godmother Club now, because I've introduced some of my mentees to each other. And again, they always mentor me, so it's two-way. But I would encourage people, a lot of business is sort of an apprenticeship, and the nuances of dealing with tricky situations, or especially for women. Women don't like to say no to things. I think women need a lot of support in how to, stand up for themselves without fear of not being liked, because I think that is a big part of how women are brought into, at least how I was brought into the work world, is that I had to be a good girl. And I was literally told not to talk in meetings because I had a lot to say. And so, those kinds of situations were difficult because there was nobody really telling me, yeah, it's okay to speak up in a meeting. It was actually a woman who told me that. So, I think we just have to recognize that for women, especially, there are institutional ways of dealing with women that sometimes need a woman or a smart man to help break through, especially in organizations that have had, longstanding legacies. So I'm always loving the conversation about mentorship. So if anybody wants to be a mentor, happy to talk to them if they want to reach out. It's really simple, and I think it's got a lot of great value.
Great. Thank you so much. That was Linda Ong. She's the CEO and founder of CULTIQUE. She's been a cultural advisor to many leading media and technology companies. Thank you again, Linda, for joining us and sharing all of these insights today.
Thank you, Tiffany.
Great.